What would you do if you found out the person you trusted most had betrayed you in the worst way possible? The sun was setting over the quiet suburban streets of Austin, Texas, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. Inside a modest brick house, Abel Johnson sat alone in his living room, a glass of whiskey in one hand and a faded family photo in the other. The picture was from happier times. Abel, his wife Margaret, and their daughter Emily, all smiles at Emily's wedding just 2 years ago. Now, Emily was living in Spain with her husband, and the house felt emptier than ever. Abel's eyes drifted to the medical report on the coffee table. His hands trembled as he picked it up, the words HIV positive glaring back at him like a death sentence. His mind raced. He hadn't been with anyone else in over 30 years of marriage. There was only one person who could have given this to him. The sound of a car pulling into the garage snapped him out of his thoughts. Margaret was home. Abel's jaw tightened. He set the glass down, stood up, and walked over to the safe in the corner of the room. With a few quick turns, he unlocked it and pulled out his old service handgun. The weight of it felt familiar in his hands, a grim reminder of his years as a police officer. He took a deep breath, his heart pounding in his chest. The door from the garage creaked open. Margaret's footsteps echoed down the hallway. Abel's grip tightened on the gun. This was it. The moment everything would change. What happened next would shock the entire neighborhood and leave everyone asking one haunting question. Was this tragedy inevitable, or could it have been stopped? Margaret stepped into the house, her arms laden with grocery bags. She hummed softly to herself, completely unaware of the storm waiting for her in the living room. Abel? She called out, kicking off her shoes. I got that pasta sauce you like? Thought we could. Her words caught in her throat as she turned the corner and saw him. Abel stood in the middle of the room, his face pale, his eyes burning with a mix of rage and pain, and in his hand, a gun pointed directly at her. Abel? She whispered, her voice trembling. What? What are you doing? Sit down, he said, his voice low and steady, but with an edge that sent chills down her spine. Margaret dropped the bags, the sound of glass jars shattering against the floor echoing through the house. She slowly lowered herself onto the couch, her eyes never leaving the gun. Abel, please, talk to me. What's going on? Abel's hand shook as he held the gun, but his aim didn't waver. I got my test results today, he said, his voice cracking. HIV positive. Margaret's face went white. Her mouth opened, but no words came out. I haven't been with anyone else, Margaret, not in 30 years. You know that. So tell me, how did this happen? Tears welled up in her eyes. Abel, I don't know what to say. Don't lie to me, he roared, the sound making her flinch. I searched your things. I found your medication, your test results. You've known for months, haven't you? And you didn't tell me. You let me. His voice broke, and for a moment he looked like he might collapse. Margaret buried her face in her hands, sobbing. I was scared, Abel. I didn't know how to tell you. I thought you'd leave me. Leave you? Abel let out a bitter laugh. You're the one who left me, Margaret. Every time you cheated, every time you lied, I forgave you. I took you back. And this is how you repay me? The memories came flooding back. The fights, the accusations, the nights Abel spent alone wondering where she was. He'd caught her once, years ago, with a man from her office. They'd separated for a while, but eventually she'd begged for another chance. I'll never do it again, she'd promised. And like a fool, he'd believed her. I trusted you, Abel said, his voice barely above a whisper now. I gave you everything, and you destroyed me. Margaret looked up, her face streaked with tears. I'm sorry, Abel. I'm so sorry. I never meant for this to happen. I was ashamed. I didn't want to lose you. You lost me the moment you decided to keep this from me, he said, his voice cold. Do you have any idea what this means? What my life is going to be like now? The stigma? The shame? I'm a retired cop, Margaret. I've spent my life upholding the law, protecting people. And now I'm just another statistic. The room was thick with tension, the air heavy with unspoken words and broken promises. Margaret reached out a hand, as if to touch him, but Abel stepped back, the gun still trained on her. Please, Abel, she begged. Put the gun down. We can figure this out. We can get through this together. Together? He spat. There is no together anymore. You made sure of that. Outside, a dog barked, and the faint sound of children playing drifted through the window. But inside the house, it felt like the world had stopped turning. Margaret's sobs grew louder, her body shaking with the weight of her guilt. Abel's mind raced, torn between the man he used to be, the cop who swore to protect and serve, and the man he'd become, broken and betrayed. Then, the sound of sirens. Distant at first, but growing louder with each passing second. Abel's heart sank. The neighbors must have heard the shouting and called the police. Margaret's eyes widened in panic. Abel, please, don't do anything stupid. Think about Emily. Think about our daughter. Abel's grip on the gun tightened. Emily, his little girl, thousands of miles away, blissfully unaware that her parents' world was crumbling. He thought about the life he'd planned for his retirement, traveling, spending time with Margaret, maybe even visiting Emily in Spain. All of it gone in an instant. The sirens were closer now, maybe just a block away. Abel's mind was a whirlwind of emotions: anger, betrayal, despair. He looked at Margaret, her face pale and tear-streaked, and for a moment he saw the woman he'd fallen in love with all those years ago. But the moment passed. The sirens were deafening now, their wails slicing through the tension in the room like a knife. Abel's mind raced, each thought more chaotic than the last. He thought about his life, his old life. The life where he was Officer Abel Johnson, a decorated cop who'd spent decades serving his community. The life where he was respected, admired, even feared. Now, he was just a man with a gun, standing over his wife, his world crumbling around him. HIV. The word echoed in his mind like a death knell. He thought about the stigma, the whispers, the pitying looks. He thought about the retirement parties he'd never attend, the friends who'd slowly drift away, the neighbors who'd cross the street to avoid him. He thought about Emily, his daughter, and how he'd have to tell her that her father was, what? A victim? A fool? A monster? Margaret's voice broke through his thoughts, soft and pleading. Abel, please, put the gun down. We can fix this. We can get you treatment. We can fix this. Abel interrupted, his voice trembling with rage. You think this is something you can fix? You think a pill or a doctor can erase what you've done? You knew, Margaret. You knew you were sick, and you didn't tell me. You didn't protect me. You didn't care. Margaret's sobs grew louder, her hands clutching at her chest as if trying to hold herself together. I was scared, Abel. I didn't know how to tell you. I thought you'd hate me. I do hate you, he said, the words slipping out before he could stop them. And in that moment, he realized they were true. He hated her for betraying him. He hated her for lying to him. He hated her for taking away the future he'd worked so hard to build. The sirens were closer now, maybe just a street away. Abel's heart pounded in his chest, each beat a reminder of the ticking clock. He thought about the police officers who'd soon burst through the door, his former colleagues, men and women he'd trained with, laughed with, trusted. They'd see him like this, a broken man with a gun, and they'd arrest him. He'd spend the rest of his life in prison, branded as a murderer. Or worse, they'd take him to a hospital where he'd live out his days as a social outcast, a cautionary tale. Abel Johnson, the retired cop who couldn't even protect himself from his own wife. Margaret was still crying, her voice barely audible over the sirens. Abel, please, think about Emily. Think about what this will do to her. She needs us. She needs you. Emily. The thought of his daughter was like a punch to the gut. She was his everything, his pride, his joy, his reason for living. But how could he face her now? How could he tell her that her mother had destroyed their family, that her father had destroyed himself? The sirens were right outside now, their flashing lights casting eerie shadows through the windows. Abel's hands tightened around the gun, his knuckles white. He thought about the life he'd lost, the future he'd never have. He thought about the shame, the guilt, the endless pain. And then, in a moment of clarity, he made his decision. The room was eerily silent for a moment, as if the world itself was holding its breath. Then, with a deafening bang, the gun went off. Margaret's body jerked backward, her hands flying to her chest as a crimson stain spread across her blouse. Her eyes widened in shock, her mouth opening as if to scream, but no sound came out. She collapsed onto the couch, her breath coming in shallow, ragged gasps. Abel didn't hesitate. He fired again, this time aiming for her stomach. The second shot echoed through the house, a grim punctuation to the end of their story. Margaret's body slumped forward, her head falling to the side as the life drained from her eyes. For a moment, Abel just stood there. the gun still in his hand, his chest heaving. He looked at Margaret, at the woman he'd loved for over 30 years, and felt nothing but emptiness. The sirens were right outside now, the sound of car doors slamming and voices shouting filling the air. Abel knew he didn't have much time. He thought about the police officers who'd soon burst through the door, his former colleagues, men and women he'd once called friends. He thought about the questions they'd ask, the judgment in their eyes. He thought about the trial, the media, the endless scrutiny. And then he thought about Emily, his little girl, thousands of miles away, about to receive the worst news of her life. He couldn't do that to her. He couldn't let her see him like this, broken, defeated, a shadow of the man he used to be. With trembling hands, Abel raised the gun to his temple. He closed his eyes, took a deep breath, and pulled the trigger. The sound of the gunshot was muffled, almost anticlimactic. Abel's body crumpled to the floor, the gun slipping from his hand as blood pooled beneath him. The house was silent again, the only sound the faint ticking of the clock on the wall. Outside, the police officers moved quickly, their weapons drawn as they approached the house. They'd been called about a domestic disturbance, but nothing could have prepared them for what they found inside. The first officer through the door froze, his eyes widening in shock. "Oh my God," he whispered, his voice barely audible. The scene was gruesome. Margaret's body lay on the couch, her lifeless eyes staring at the ceiling. Abel's body was on the floor, a pool of blood spreading beneath him. The air was thick with the metallic smell of gunpowder and blood, a grim reminder of the tragedy that had just unfolded. The officers moved cautiously, checking for signs of life, but it was clear there was nothing they could do. 2 lives had been lost, a family shattered, and a neighborhood left in shock. As the news spread, the quiet suburban street became a circus of flashing lights, curious neighbors, and reporters hungry for a story. But behind the chaos, there was a deeper, more haunting question. How had it come to this? The investigation began almost immediately. Police officers and forensic teams combed through the house, piecing together the final moments of Abel and Margaret's lives. They found Abel's medical records on the coffee table, the words HIV positive stark against the white paper. In the bedroom, they discovered Margaret's hidden stash of antiretroviral medication and her own test results dated 8 months prior. The story began to take shape, a marriage plagued by infidelity, a devastating diagnosis, and a betrayal that cut deeper than anyone could have imagined. Investigators interviewed neighbors who spoke of hearing raised voices and gunshots. They reviewed Abel's service record, painting a picture of a man who had dedicated his life to justice, only to meet a tragic end. Meanwhile, in Spain, Emily Johnson was living a life far removed from the chaos in Texas. She'd just finished breakfast when the phone rang. The voice on the other end was calm but somber, delivering news that would shatter her world. Her parents were dead. Her father had killed her mother before turning the gun on himself. Emily collapsed onto the floor, her hands trembling as she tried to process the words. Her husband held her as she sobbed, her mind racing with questions she couldn't answer. How could this have happened? Her parents had their issues, sure, but this was unthinkable. She booked the first flight back to Texas, her heart heavy with grief and confusion. When she arrived, she was met with a whirlwind of police reports, funeral arrangements, and the harsh reality of her new life as an orphan. Back in the neighborhood, the community was divided. Some sympathized with Abel, understanding the pain of betrayal and the weight of a life-altering diagnosis. "He was a good man," one neighbor said. "He just snapped." Who wouldn't in his situation? Others were less forgiving. "Nothing justifies what he did," another neighbor argued. "He took a life. He took her life. That's unforgivable." The local news outlets picked up the story, turning it into a sensational headline: "Retired cop kills wife, then himself in shocking murder-suicide." The details of the case sparked heated debates online and in living rooms across the country. Was Abel a victim or a villain? Was Margaret's betrayal worse than his actions? Could this tragedy have been prevented? Emily found herself grappling with these questions as she sorted through her parents' belongings. She found old photo albums, love letters, and mementos from happier times. She also found the medical records and the medication, the pieces of a puzzle she couldn't bring herself to solve. As she stood in the empty house, surrounded by the remnants of her parents' lives, one question haunted her more than any other. Why didn't they talk to me? This story is one of betrayal, heartbreak, and unimaginable choices. It forces us to ask ourselves, what would we have done in Abel's shoes? Was Margaret's betrayal unforgivable? She knew she was HIV positive for months and chose not to tell him, exposing him to a life-altering diagnosis. But did that justify Abel's actions? Was his rage understandable? Or did he cross a line that can never be uncrossed? And what about revenge? How far would you go if you felt your life had been ruined by someone you loved? Would you seek justice, or would you let the pain consume you? These are the questions that linger long after the story ends. There are no easy answers, no clear heroes or villains, just two broken people and a tragedy that could have been avoided. Now it's your turn to weigh in. What do you think? Was Abel justified in what he did, or did he let his anger take him too far? Could Margaret have done more to prevent this outcome? And most importantly, what would you have done if you were in Abel's position? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Let's start a conversation about love, betrayal, and the choices that define us. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more gripping, emotionally charged stories that will keep you on the edge of your seat. This is a story that will stay with you long after the screen fades to black. And remember, sometimes the most haunting stories are the ones that hit closest to home. Thank you for following along with this tragic tale. If you found it compelling, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss a story. Until next time, stay curious, stay engaged, and keep asking the hard questions.